Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Governed. And in light of the recent election at the national level of Donald Trump, who is now the president, and the fact that Washington State, where I live, is suffering the consequences of unfortunately electing a bunch of crazy people, especially starting with our governor candidate, the question that people have who live here in Washington and outside the state looking in is, what does the Trump administration, what can they do that could impact some of the challenges that we face in Washington State? Well, I'm going to get into that in this video right now. But before I do, I want to just remind you, if you haven't hit the like or subscribe button, please do so down below. Share this video with as many people as you possibly can. You know just as well as I do that Google likes to shadow ban these stories, and they've been doing that to my channel for years. But again, the more people that actually see these videos, the more of an impact I know that we have. So please make a point of just sharing it with a couple people today. Now, getting back to the unfortunate mistake we made of electing this clown to our governor's office, the interesting thing is that people are quite worried about having Bob Ferguson as the governor of Washington State, and they're right to be worried. But the funny thing is, I'm not sure how much he's going to be a governor of Washington State, since his entire identity appears to be wrapped up around Donald Trump, as one of his first press conferences already post-election have shown. Here we see basically Bob Ferguson, the former Attorney General of, well, he's still Attorney General for a few more months, but he's basically introducing Nick Brown, who's the newly elected Attorney General, and functions like a mini-me to Bob Ferguson. And Bob Ferguson and Nick Brown are actually bragging about the fact that they plan to do everything, spend their time and the whole resources of the Attorney General's office and the state of Washington in fighting with Donald Trump. Now, I think this is mostly just a re-election campaign plan for Bob Ferguson, but the one thing that it indicates is that he's clearly not focused on anybody in Washington State, and it's primarily just obsessed and focused on Donald Trump. Now, that's good enough by itself, but the question is, what could a Trump administration do to actually help those of us who want to have more liberty and freedom and not the abusive political policies that are imposed by somebody like Ferguson or some of these other people in Washington State? And this is a good question. So let's just talk a couple of very specific things that the Trump administration does right now and has the authority to do to actually make an impact here. One of the first things that I don't think people are talking about enough is the Trump administration. Obviously, they're going to be putting in a new federal attorney general, the Department of Justice, and as part of that process, they're going to be appointing new U.S. attorneys. And these are federal attorneys. Usually there's one office in Seattle and one in Spokane, and their job is to represent the Department of Justice at the state level where we live. Now, historically, for the last half a dozen Republican administrations, they typically, if they appoint a new U.S. attorney, and remember years ago they used to kind of let some of these attorneys just go administration to administration, and that's not going to happen now. They're definitely going to be appointing new ones, but historically Republicans have oftentimes just appointed people in these positions that are essentially resume builders. They really don't want to be doing anything that matters too significantly. They kind of fill the seat in the office. It helps them pad their resume when they leave in 4 years, and that's about it. This has been the history. Even in the first Trump administration, we didn't see a lot of activity with these new, with whoever the U.S. attorneys are, and that has changed, and it should change for the Trump administration. If I was to give them any advice, and I'm a small guy with not a big voice, but I would definitely point a new U.S. attorney and the Department of Justice in general to open up, for probably the first time in at least half a century, some serious work into public integrity investigations in our state. Nobody's ever bothered to look at just the vast sum of cash that gets squandered by our federal government and ends up in the pockets of big donors, insiders, grifted into all kinds of different operations, and laws are probably broken right and left. But we know our Attorney General will never and never has looked into any of this, and we know that at the federal level they've never really looked into this either. There's a lot of opportunities to look into some of these things. Lehigh down in Seattle, right? A lot of these homeless industrial complex, how tied into organized crime are they? How much fraud actually goes on at DSHS, and how much do they cover up so that they don't reduce the amount of funds that the feds send us for DSHS type services? So we really have a tremendous opportunity to appoint people here who actually care for probably the first time in decades about actually looking into these issues. And it could have a very significant, tangible impact in our state, especially as they uncover and expose some of this fraud and corruption that has been concealed or at least ignored for a long, long time. That's a big deal. That's definitely something the Trump administration has an immediate direct impact on. Another one, and this one's close to my heart, is also federal election reform. There's a number of different things that have been discussed extensively by the Trump administration, and I think actually they're serious this time, and it has to do with screwed up election systems all around the country. Now, part of this is because of his direct experience in 2020, and where did those 10 million mystery secret sauce voters that somehow were around in 2020, but they don't exist today, where did they go? We don't know, and that's a good question. But as it applies to Washington State, and just the continuing screw-ups here, it's not just here, but it's California, Colorado, Oregon, and Nevada, or Arizona, where they really can't figure out who's been elected for weeks and sometimes even longer. It really is exposing for the whole world to see just how ridiculous our voting system is compared to the rest of the world. So a federal election reform would not solve everything, but it would probably, similar to the 60s and the 90s when it's been done before, probably they would go back and look at addressing mail-in voting by probably requiring something like in-person voting, or at least requiring that as the dominant way that you would be voting. Having an ID verification for sure is going to be part of this discussion. Renewal of registration on a regular basis, so you can make sure that signatures are updated, that these people are real, that they haven't left the country, that they still live there, and that would probably reduce the fact that, like King 5 News exposed, that somebody in Seattle's getting 16 ballots sent to their mailbox. And of course, it would basically shrink the amount of time so that, like most third world countries, we could actually achieve their level of success and count our ballots in a much shorter period of time. Whatever this election reform, federal election reform priority is, it's going to make our state's election system far better than the current opaque fiasco that it's become. And it's a challenge to work in it, and it's become less transparent, less honest, less clear over the last few years in particular. So it'd be nice if we could reverse some of that. And for federal elections, they can do that at the federal level. And if they can do it at the federal level, then there's no reason why that wouldn't also be applied at the local level. They usually don't have two totally different tiers of election systems. That would be weird. But we are Washington State, but nevertheless, that still moves us in the right direction. The other thing that the Trump administration has talked about, and I'll kind of put this under the category of just eliminate wasted grants. Now, he's talked about this in the context of sanctuary states. If you're going to be a sanctuary state and you're going to invite criminals like our state does to come and reside here, then you're going to not be recipients of grant money. Now, Bob Ferguson has thrown a fit about that. Chris Reichel's thrown a fit about it. A number of these Democrats have thrown fits about this in our state. But the reality is, if the Trump administration actually does federal downsizing, and it includes reducing some of these grants, that's a good thing for our state. Just because we receive tax dollars doesn't mean those dollars are spent well or on anything that matters. The huge percentage of the tax dollars that we receive in our state are wasted and squandered on just insider kickback grifting schemes all over the place, and we see this waste every day. Anybody that looks, the only way you can't see the waste is if you don't look. So eliminating how much money comes here would be a big deal. Now, kind of related to this was the recent announcement 2 days ago that the Trump administration made that I hadn't even thought about before, was looking at higher education and just the scam that many of these higher education, so-called higher education colleges have become, and basically removing their accreditation. Now, that would be great, and we obviously have one of the outlier colleges in America, Evergreen State College, where I live in Thurston County. One of the biggest embarrassments to education, or at least using the word education associated with that institution. Getting rid of that institution would be a good thing. Now, just because the feds basically take away their accreditation, obviously that should have happened long ago, but just because they do it this time, it doesn't mean that Evergreen College necessarily gets shut down, but it probably helps point it in that direction. It would also be a good sign to people who accidentally end up going there for college, and it would help them avoid making that mistake in the future. So all these are good things things. These are direct impacts on us in Washington State where we live, and it could be a significant change. And, I'm going to go back a little bit here, too, just to the attorneys. If you actually have U.S. district attorneys here, or U.S. attorneys, from the Department of Justice here who care about freedom and liberty and civil rights, they could address some of the abuses that have occurred in Washington State on the attempt to silence free speech, for example. Bob Ferguson's been a champion of that. And the federal government can come down and address that because that is a constitutional issue. If you have a good U.S. attorney, they can deal with some of the abuse of the Second Amendment that Bob Ferguson has also taken point on and attempting to make us more vulnerable to criminals. And Bob Ferguson's effort to reward sex offenders and release them secretly into our neighborhoods. There's a lot of things I think that the feds could have some kind of an impact on. It would be a positive thing. Now, this is important for those of us who care about Washington State. Many of us feel that we know that our state court system is thoroughly corrupted, almost from top to bottom. It is very hard and almost impossible to find a judge who's remotely honest in the state, who's not totally corrupt to the political class, and makes decisions almost entirely based on the political instructions that they've received. We feel like justice has been denied so long locally that many people, I think, aren't aware of how to attain any kind of justice in the state when you're faced with the abuse of Bob Ferguson's history at the Attorney General's office, or the many agencies that have essentially gone rogue and run roughshod over people in our state. Well, things like that could change if the federal government's involved in actually helping restore some of our civil liberties that have been taken away. Some of that's going to have to come back on into the justice system, and to actually feel like justice isn't just going to get buried the way it's historically been in the state could be a big deal. And you could see some change here pretty quickly. But I think it's helpful if, for those of us who care about these issues, to communicate to anybody and everybody we know in this incoming administration, giving them suggestions and ideas and requesting their help in our state. I think it starts a little bit with that. So if you want something to do over the holidays, please send lots of requests to the Trump administration, making sure that if they're going to appoint U.S. attorneys, they're going to be fighters, people who actually care about these issues and willing to actually have conflict to resolve some of the problems that our state has basically been attempting to hide and bury for so long. Help them look closer at Evergreen State College. Help them fix the election system nationally so that we don't have to be the national embarrassment and the worldwide embarrassment that our election systems become. There's a lot of great opportunities that exist here. It's pretty amazing, really, and not what I ever would have expected doing a video about a week ago. So the fact that this is even a part of the conversation is a big deal. But when I talk about these things that you and I can do, it means these are things you can actually do yourself. It's part of just showing up. And this is important because, as I always say, it gives you something to do and it's something practical and useful, because if you don't show up, then nothing happens. Because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.